You walk into meetings where your ideas are dismissed before you finish speaking, while colleagues with less experience somehow command the room's attention. Every day you watch others effortlessly gain respect and influence while you struggle to be heard, your contributions overlooked despite your expertise and hard work. I am Dale Carnegie, and I transformed from a terrified farm boy who couldn't speak in public to the man who taught millions how to win friends and influence people. What I discovered about earning genuine respect will revolutionize how others perceive and respond to you. Using the same principles that helped presidents, business leaders, and everyday people command attention and admiration, the techniques I'll share aren't about manipulation or false confidence. They're about unlocking the natural leadership qualities that already exist within you, proven through decades of teaching and real-world application. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for transformation. Let me take you back to a dirt-poor farm in Missouri, where I learned my first lesson about respect, or rather, the painful absence of it. My family worked from dawn to dusk just to survive, and in our small farming community, respect seemed reserved for those with money, education, or natural charisma. I had none of these things. I was the awkward kid who stuttered when called upon in school, whose clothes were patched and whose shoes had holes that I tried desperately to hide. When I walked into a room, conversations didn't pause, they simply continued as if I weren't there. I was invisible, and invisibility, I learned, is the opposite of respect. My father raised hogs and cattle, and while he was a good man, he commanded no particular influence beyond our property lines. My mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. We were hard-working, honest people, but in the social hierarchy of our small town, we occupied the bottom rung. I watched other families, the bankers, children, the doctors' sons move through the world with a confidence I couldn't fathom. They spoke, and people listened. They entered rooms, and heads turned. They possessed something I desperately wanted, but had no idea how to obtain. At 14, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I enrolled in the Warrensburg State Teachers College, not because I felt called to teaching, but because it was the only path I could see towards something better than the poverty that had defined my childhood. I had no money for room and board, so I lived at home and rode horseback 6 miles each way to attend classes. The first months were torture. I sat in the back of every classroom, terrified that a professor might call on me when forced to speak. My voice would crack and my hands would shake. I was that farm boy again, wearing my father's old shirts and feeling completely out of place among students who seemed born to success. But something happened during my second semester that changed everything. Professor Mills announced that the college would be hosting debate competitions, and he encouraged all students to participate. Most of my classmates showed polite interest, but ultimately declined. The confident ones felt they were above such exercises. The shy ones, like myself, felt they were beneath them. I almost didn't sign up. The thought of standing before an audience, arguing a point, defending a position, it terrified me more than anything I'd ever contemplated. But something deeper than fear drove me forward. I was tired of being invisible. I was exhausted by my own insignificance. My first debate was a disaster. I stammered, lost my train of thought, and felt the burning embarrassment of public failure. But I also felt something I'd never experienced before, the electric charge of holding an audience's attention, even briefly. For those few minutes, awkward as they were, people were listening to me. Dale Carnegie, the poor farm boy, had something to say, and people were paying attention. I threw myself into debate preparation with the intensity of someone fighting for his life, because in many ways, I was. I practiced in front of mirrors. I argued with fence posts. I debated imaginary opponents while milking cows. I studied not just the facts and logic required for debate, but the speakers themselves. I watched how they stood, how they gestured, how they modulated their voices for maximum impact. Slowly, something remarkable began to happen. My confidence grew not just in debate, but in all my classes. When I knew I could defend a position articulately and persuasively, I became more willing to participate in discussions. When I saw professors nod approvingly at my arguments, I began to believe I might actually have something valuable to contribute. The transformation wasn't just internal. Other students began seeking me out for study groups. Professors started calling on me not with the expectation of watching me fail, but with genuine interest in hearing my perspective. I was no longer invisible. I was becoming someone whose opinions mattered. The culmination came during my senior year, when I won the college's debate championship. Standing on that stage, holding that small bronze trophy, I realized I had discovered something more valuable than gold: the secret of commanding respect through the power of thoughtful, passionate communication. But the real lesson came afterward. Instead of basking in my victory, I found myself immediately thinking about how I could help other shy, awkward, invisible students discover what I had learned. I realized that my painful journey from insignificance to recognition hadn't been just about my personal transformation. It had been preparation for something larger. That's when I knew I would become a teacher, not of subjects, but of something far more important: how to help people find their voice, command attention, and earn the respect that every human being deserves. The farm boy who had once been invisible was ready to help others step into the light. The most profound lesson about respect didn't come from a textbook or a professor. It came from watching my father interact with a traveling salesman on a sweltering August afternoon when I was 19 years old. We were in the middle of harvest season, and my father was exhausted, dirty, and wearing clothes that had seen better days 5 years earlier. When the well-dressed salesman pulled up in his shiny automobile to pitch some new farming equipment, I expected the usual dynamic: the educated city man talking down to the simple farmer, trying to part him from his hard-earned dollars. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Within minutes of their conversation, I watched this sophisticated salesman, a man who likely earned more in a month than we made in a year, begin deferring to my father's opinion, asking for his advice, and treating him with genuine reverence. My father wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't put on airs or pretend to be someone he wasn't. Instead, he did something remarkable. He made that salesman feel like the most important person in the world. He asked thoughtful questions about the man's travels, his family, his challenges on the road. He really listened to the answers. When the salesman mentioned his concern about his son's health problems, my father shared his own experiences with childhood illnesses and offered genuine sympathy and practical advice. I stood there, transfixed, watching this masterclass in human relations unfold. The salesman, who had arrived with the clear intention of conducting a quick transaction and moving on, ended up staying for 2 hours. He bought nothing that day, but he left our farm as if he'd received something far more valuable than money. He left feeling valued, understood, and respected. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the afternoon's events, a revolutionary understanding washed over me. Respect wasn't something you demanded or commanded. It was something you created by making others feel respected first. My father, with his 8th grade education and calloused hands, had commanded more genuine respect in 2 hours than most people achieve in a lifetime. And he'd done it not by talking about himself, but by focusing entirely on the other person. This realization shattered everything I thought I knew about influence and authority. I had been approaching respect all wrong. In my debate competitions, I had been trying to prove how smart I was, how well prepared, how superior my arguments were. I was focused on winning, on being right, on demonstrating my worth. But watching my father, I understood that true respect flows to those who make others feel worthy. The difference was profound. Authority based on position or knowledge or superiority is fragile and temporary. It requires constant reinforcement and creates resentment even when it achieves compliance. But respect based on making others feel valued is self-reinforcing. The more you give it, the more you receive. The more you focus on others, the more magnetic you become. I began experimenting with this principle immediately. Instead of trying to impress my fellow students with my knowledge, I started asking them about their interests, their challenges, their dreams. Instead of positioning myself as the expert in study groups, I positioned myself as someone genuinely interested in understanding different perspectives. The results were immediate and dramatic. People began seeking me out for conversations that had nothing to do with academics. Classmates who had barely noticed me before started inviting me to social gatherings. Professors began engaging me in discussions that extended well beyond the classroom requirements. I wasn't becoming more impressive. I was becoming more interested in others, and that interest was being returned with genuine respect and affection. But the real test came when I began my teaching career. Standing before my first class of adult students, farmers and laborers, who had returned to education later in life, faced a choice. I could try to establish my authority through knowledge and position, demanding respect because of my title and education, or I could earn their respect by respecting them first. I chose the latter, and it changed not just my teaching, but my entire philosophy of human relations. Instead of lecturing from a position of superiority, I positioned myself as someone fascinated by their experiences, their wisdom, their unique perspectives. I asked about their work, their families, their dreams deferred and hopes rekindled. I listened to their stories not as curiosities, but as treasures. The transformation in my classroom was remarkable. These were men and women who had been talked down to by educated people their entire lives, who expected to be made to feel inferior and inadequate. Instead, they found themselves in an environment where their life experiences were valued, where their perspectives were sought, where their dignity was not just preserved but elevated. That worn pair of work gloves hanging by our kitchen door became my daily reminder of this fundamental truth. Respect is not about what you accomplish, or what you know, or what position you hold. It's about how you make others feel about themselves. My father, in his simple wisdom, had mastered the most sophisticated principle of human relations, and in watching him, I discovered the foundation upon which I would build everything I taught for the rest of my life. 3 months into my first teaching position, I received a crumpled letter that would teach me more about human nature than any psychology textbook ever could. It was from Robert, a middle-aged farmer in my evening class who had been struggling with basic arithmetic. The letter was angry, hurt, and brutally honest about how my teaching methods were making him feel. "Mr. Carnegie," he wrote, "you may be educated, and I may be just a dumb farmer, but I'm not stupid. Every time you correct my mistakes in front of the class, every time you show me the right way to solve a problem, you're telling everyone in that room that I'm not good enough. I came here to learn, not to be made a fool of." I read that letter 3 times, each reading hitting me like a physical blow. Robert was right. In my eagerness to help, in my desire to be a good teacher, I had been making the most fundamental mistake that destroys respect. I had been trying to prove my worth by highlighting others' shortcomings. This revelation forced me to examine not just my teaching methods, but human nature itself. I began to understand why so many intelligent, well-meaning people fail to earn respect despite their best efforts. They make the same mistake I had been making. They try to elevate themselves by pointing out where others fall short. The psychology behind this mistake is both understandable and destructive. When we feel insecure about our own worth, Our natural instinct is to demonstrate our value by comparison. We correct others' errors to show our knowledge. We point out flaws to highlight our standards. We criticize to demonstrate our sophistication. We think that by showing what's wrong with others, we're showing what's right with ourselves. But here's what I learned from Robert's letter and from observing countless interactions afterward. Criticism doesn't create respect, creates defensiveness. Correction doesn't build authority, it builds resentment. When you make someone feel wrong, stupid, or inadequate, you don't make yourself appear smarter or more capable. You make yourself appear arrogant and insensitive. The human ego is the most sensitive instrument in existence. It reacts to perceived threats with the same intensity as physical danger. When you criticize someone, you're not just correcting a mistake, you're attacking their self-worth. And people don't respect those who attack them. They defend against them. I started paying closer attention to conversations around me, and I was amazed by how often people unknowingly sabotaged their own relationships through criticism and correction. The husband who constantly pointed out his wife's cooking mistakes, then wondered why she became cold and distant. The manager who publicly corrected employees' errors, then couldn't understand why his team lacked enthusiasm. The parent who frequently criticized their children's choices, then felt hurt when the children stopped confiding in them. In each case, the intention was often good, to help, to improve, to guide. But the method was destructive because it violated a fundamental principle of human nature. People need to feel good about themselves, and they will resist anyone who threatens that need. I completely transformed my teaching approach. Instead of correcting Robert's arithmetic mistakes in front of the class, I would quietly work with him individually. Instead of highlighting what was wrong with his calculations, I would acknowledge what he had done right and then guide him toward better methods. Instead of making him feel stupid, I made him feel capable of improvement. The change in Robert was immediate and dramatic. His confidence grew, his performance improved, and most importantly, his respect for me increased exponentially. But the real revelation came when other students began approaching me after class, thanking me for creating an environment where they felt safe to make mistakes and learn. This taught me another crucial insight. When you protect people's dignity, they don't just respect you, they become loyal to you. When you help people feel good about themselves, they associate those positive feelings with you. When you create psychological safety, people open up, engage more deeply, and become genuinely invested in the relationship. The principle extends far beyond the classroom. In every interaction, you have a choice. You can try to prove your worth by diminishing others, or you can build your reputation by building others up. You can correct their mistakes and make them feel small, or you can guide their improvement and make them feel capable. The irony is that people who constantly correct others to demonstrate their superiority actually diminish their own standing. They become known as nitpickers, know-it-alls, or bullies. Meanwhile, those who focus on building others up become known as leaders, mentors, and inspiring figures. I learned to ask myself a simple question before offering any correction or criticism. Will this make the person feel better about themselves or worse? If the answer was worse, I found a different approach. I discovered that you can guide people toward better performance without making them feel inadequate. That you can share knowledge without making others feel ignorant. That you can maintain high standards without destroying people's confidence. This shift in approach didn't just change how others perceived MIT, changed how I perceived myself. Instead of deriving my sense of worth from being right or superior, I began deriving it from helping others feel capable and valued. Instead of building my ego by highlighting others' mistakes, I built my reputation by helping others succeed. That crumpled letter from Robert became one of my most treasured possessions, a constant reminder that respect is never built on the ruins of someone else's dignity. True respect comes not from proving others wrong, but from helping them feel right about themselves. In 1921, I had the extraordinary opportunity to interview Henry Ford, the most powerful industrialist in America. I expected to meet a man consumed with his own importance, someone who would lecture me about his achievements and innovations. Instead, I discovered something that would revolutionize my understanding of why some people command universal respect, while others, despite their accomplishments, remain merely tolerated. Henry Ford spent the first 20 minutes of our interview asking me questions, not polite, perfunctory questions, but deep, probing inquiries about my work, my observations about education, my thoughts on helping people develop confidence. He leaned forward when I spoke, asked follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely processing my answers, and made me feel like my insights were the most fascinating things he'd heard all week. Here was a man who controlled an industrial empire, who had revolutionized manufacturing and transportation, who could have spent our entire meeting talking about his groundbreaking achievements. Instead, he was fascinated by what I, a relatively unknown teacher, had to say about human development. When he finally did share his own experiences, it was in response to something I had said, building on my thoughts rather than overwhelming them with his superior knowledge. I left that interview feeling like I was 10 feet tall. Henry Ford, the most influential businessman in the world, had made me feel important, valued, heard, but more significantly, my respect for him had increased exponentially, not because of what he had told me about himself, but because of how interested he had been in me. This encounter crystallized something I had been observing but hadn't fully understood. Genuine interest in others is the most powerful force for building respect and influence that exists. It's more magnetic than charisma, more persuasive than logic, more influential than authority. The psychology behind this principle is profound. Every human being has an almost desperate need to feel important, to believe that their thoughts, experiences, and perspectives matter. Most people go through their days feeling largely invisible, unheard, unimportant. When someone comes along who shows genuine fascination with who they are and what they think, the effect is almost intoxicating. But here's the crucial distinction. The interest must be genuine. People have an uncanny ability to detect fake curiosity, and nothing destroys respect faster than the sense that someone is manipulating them with insincere attention. The interest I witnessed in Henry Ford wasn't a technique, it was authentic. Fascination with human nature and individual experience. I began studying people who naturally commanded respect, and I discovered this pattern repeatedly. The most influential teachers weren't those who impressed students with their knowledge, but those who were genuinely curious about their students' thoughts and experiences. The most effective managers weren't those who demonstrated their expertise, but those who showed sincere interest in their employees' ideas and challenges. The most beloved family members weren't those who had the most to say, but those who were most interested in what others had to say. I started experimenting with this principle systematically. In conversations, instead of waiting for my turn to speak or thinking about what impressive point I might make next, I focused entirely on understanding the other person. I asked about their work, their challenges, their passions, their concerns. I listened not just to their words, but to the emotions behind them. I asked follow-up questions that showed I was truly engaged with their responses. The results were immediate and remarkable. People began seeking me out for conversations. They started sharing more personal thoughts and feelings. They asked for my advice and opinions, not because I had tried to impress them with my wisdom, but because I had shown genuine interest in theirs. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that genuine interest creates a reciprocal effect. When you show sincere fascination with someone, they begin to see you as fascinating. When you make them feel important, they perceive you as important. When you treat their thoughts as valuable, they begin to value your thoughts in return. This principle transformed my teaching completely. Instead of beginning classes by sharing my knowledge, I began by exploring theirs. I asked about their experiences, their challenges, their goals. I discovered that a farmer who struggled with arithmetic had developed incredibly sophisticated problem-solving strategies for managing his land. I found that a factory worker who felt intimidated by formal education had insights into efficiency and teamwork that would make any business school professor envious. By showing genuine interest in what my students already knew and had experienced, I accomplished several things simultaneously. I made them feel valued and important. I gained access to their real concerns and motivations, which allowed me to tailor my teaching to their actual needs. And I positioned myself not as a superior dispensing knowledge to inferiors, but as a fascinated learner who happened to have some skills they wanted to develop. The respect this approach generated was profound and lasting. Students didn't just tolerate my classes, they looked forward to them. They didn't just complete assignments, they went above and beyond because they felt personally invested in the relationship. They didn't just learn the material, they applied it with enthusiasm because they felt heard and understood. I discovered that genuine interest is the master key to human relations. It opens doors that force cannot break down. It creates loyalty that authority cannot command. It builds influence that position cannot guarantee. When you become genuinely interested in other people, you become genuinely interesting to them. The secret is to approach every interaction with authentic curiosity about the other person's experience, perspective, and feelings. Ask questions not to gather ammunition for your own points, but to truly understand theirs. Listen not to find flaws in their logic, but to appreciate their unique viewpoint. Show interest not to manipulate their response, but to honor their humanity. This shift from self-focus to other focus is perhaps the most difficult but most rewarding transformation anyone can make. It requires setting aside your own ego's need for attention and validation, and instead finding satisfaction in making others feel valued and heard. But the respect and influence that flow from this approach are unlike anything that can be achieved through force, manipulation, or self-promotion. By 1920, I had developed what became my most treasured possession, a worn leather address book that contained not just the names of everyone I met, but carefully noted details about their lives, their interests, their families, and their concerns. This simple practice transformed me from someone who struggled to be remembered into someone who was sought out and respected wherever I went. The revelation about the power of names came to me during a chance encounter at a railroad station in Chicago. I was waiting for a delayed train when I recognized a man I had met briefly at a conference 6 months earlier. We had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes. And I remembered his name was James Morrison, and that he worked in steel manufacturing. When I approached him and said, "Mr. Morrison, how wonderful to see you again. How is your expansion into the Pittsburgh market progressing?" The transformation in his face was immediate and profound. His entire posture changed, his eyes lit up, and he broke into a genuine smile that made him look 10 years younger. For the next hour, James Morrison treated me like his oldest and dearest friend. He shared business insights, personal concerns about his family, and even invited me to visit his operations in Pittsburgh. When we finally parted, he gripped my hand firmly and said, "Dale, you're the kind of man who makes this world a better place." All because I had remembered his name and one detail about his business. That encounter taught me something profound about human psychology. A person's name represents their entire identity, their individuality, their importance in the world. When you remember and use someone's name, you're acknowledging their unique existence and value. When you forget it, you're essentially saying they're not important enough to occupy space in your memory. I began studying this phenomenon more carefully, and I discovered that our names have an almost magical effect on us. Hearing our names spoken with respect activates something deep in the human brain, a recognition of our significance, our worth, our place in the world. It's why we perk up when we hear our name mentioned across a crowded room, why we feel pleased when someone we've just met uses our name in conversation, why being called by the wrong name feels like a small assault on our identity. But remembering names is more than just a social courtesy. It's a demonstration of respect that has profound psychological effects. When someone remembers your name, especially after a brief meeting, it communicates several powerful messages. You made an impression worth remembering. You're important enough to occupy mental space, and you matter as an individual rather than just another face in the crowd. I made remembering names a systematic practice. When I met someone new, I would repeat their name immediately. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Johnson. I would use it several times during our conversation. Mrs. Johnson, what's your experience been with ... I would write it down as soon as possible. Afterward, along with key details about our interaction, my address book became a treasure trove of human connections. Next to each name, I recorded not just contact information, but personal details. 3 children, oldest starting college, recently promoted to department head, passionate about gardening, concerned about father's health. When I encountered these people again, I could ask meaningful follow-up questions that showed they had remained in my thoughts. The results were extraordinary. People began remembering me specifically because I remembered them. They sought me out at gatherings, recommended me for opportunities, and treated me with a warmth and respect that seemed disproportionate to our actual relationship depth. But it wasn't disproportionate, was a natural human response to feeling valued and remembered. I discovered that using someone's name correctly is like verbal magic. It captures attention, creates warmth, and establishes connection in ways that generic address cannot. When I said good morning to a colleague, it was polite. When I said good morning, Robert, it was personal. The difference in response was remarkable every time. But the practice taught me something even more important. Remembering names forces you to see people as individuals rather than as categories or functions. When you make the effort to learn and remember someone's name, you're acknowledging their unique humanity. You're moving beyond seeing them as the clerk, or the accountant, or the neighbor, and beginning to see them as a distinct person with their own identity and worth. This shift in perspective naturally leads to better relationships. When you see people as individuals, deserving of individual attention, you treat them differently. You're more likely to show genuine interest in their thoughts and feelings. You're more inclined to offer help when they need it. You're more motivated to treat them with courtesy and respect. The practice also revealed something fascinating about memory and attention. When I made the conscious effort to remember names, I found that I naturally began remembering other details about people as well, their interests, their concerns, their preferences, their personalities. The act of committing to remember one key piece of information, their names, seemed to open up greater capacity for remembering everything else about them. I learned to associate names with visual or emotional cues to make them stick. If I met a Thomas who was tall, I might think, tall Thomas. If I met a Sarah who smiled constantly, she became smiling Sarah in my mental notes. These associations, while private, helped me recall not just their names, but key aspects of their personalities. The compound effect of this practice over years was remarkable. I built a network of people who felt personally connected to me, who thought of me fondly, who were eager to help when I needed assistance and receptive when I offered help to them, all because I had taken the simple step of treating their names and, by extension, their identities as important enough to remember. In a world where most people are too distracted or self-focused to remember names, Simply making this effort sets you apart. It marks you as someone who pays attention, who cares about others, who treats people as individuals rather than as interchangeable parts of your environment. And that recognition generates a level of respect and affection that no amount of impressive talk about yourself could ever achieve. The most powerful speech I ever gave was delivered without saying a word. I was backstage at Carnegie Hall in 1924, preparing to address an audience of business leaders about effective communication, when I encountered a janitor who was clearly distressed. Instead of rushing past him in my pre-speech nervousness, I stopped and simply listened. For 25 minutes, this man poured out his heart about his son's struggles in school, his wife's illness, his fears about making ends meet, and his dreams of someday opening a small repair shop. I said almost nothing during this entire time, just asked an occasional gentle question or offered a sympathetic nod. When he finally finished, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Thank you, sir. I feel like a new man. You've given me more help than anyone in years." All I had done was listen. But in those 25 minutes, I had given this man something that most people rarely receive: the complete, undivided attention of another human being who cared enough to truly hear what he was saying. That encounter taught me that listening is perhaps the most undervalued and most powerful skill in human relations. In a world full of people desperate to be heard, the person who truly listens wields almost magical influence. Yet most of us are terrible listeners. We're too busy preparing our next comment, too eager to share our own experiences, too distracted by our own concerns to give others the gift of genuine attention. I began studying the art of listening with the same intensity I had once devoted to public speaking, and I discovered that great listening is far more complex and powerful than most people realize. It's not passive waiting for your turn to talk, it's active engagement with another person's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. True listening begins with your physical presence. I learned to face the person speaking, to maintain natural eye contact, to lean in slightly to show engagement. I discovered that my posture communicated as much as my words. When I appeared distracted or impatient, people would hurry through their thoughts or stop sharing altogether. When I showed physical signs of genuine interest, they would open up more completely. But physical attention is just the beginning. Real listening requires what I came to call mental hospitality, making space in your mind for someone else's ideas without immediately comparing them to your own, judging them, or planning your response. It means temporarily setting aside your own agenda to make room for theirs. I practiced listening not just to the words people spoke, but to the emotions behind them. When a student said, "I'm having trouble with this material," I learned to hear not just the academic struggle, but often the deeper fears. "I'm worried I'm not smart enough," or "I'm afraid of failing again," or "I don't want to disappoint my family." By listening for these underlying concerns, I could address the real issues rather than just the surface problems. The transformation in my relationships was immediate and dramatic. When people felt truly heard, they began sharing thoughts and feelings they had never expressed to anyone. Students confided personal struggles that were affecting their learning. Colleagues shared innovative ideas they had been afraid to voice. Family members opened up about concerns they had been carrying alone. I discovered that most people have so few opportunities to be genuinely heard that when they encounter someone who listens deeply, they form an almost instant bond with that person. They begin to see the listener as wise, understanding, and trustworthy, not because of anything the listener has said, but because of how well they have listened. The practice also taught me about the incredible complexity and richness of other people's inner lives. When I truly listened, I discovered that the quiet colleague had fascinating insights about efficiency, that the struggling student had overcome remarkable personal obstacles, that the seemingly simple farmer had developed sophisticated philosophies about life and work, But perhaps the most important lesson was about the relationship between listening and respect. When you listen to someone with complete attention, you're communicating something profound, that their thoughts and feelings are valuable enough to deserve your full focus. You're showing respect for their experience, their perspective, their humanity, and that respect is almost always returned with interest. I learned to ask questions that encouraged deeper sharing. How did that make you feel? What was that experience like for you? What do you think would work better? These weren't interrogation questions designed to gather information for my own purposes. They were invitations for the other person to explore and express their own thoughts more fully. The quality of my questions improved as I became a better listener. Instead of asking generic questions that could apply to anyone, I learned to ask specific questions based on what the person had already shared. You mentioned your concern about your son's education. What specifically worries you most? When you talked about enjoying your work despite the challenges, what is it that you find most rewarding? I also discovered the power of reflective listening, occasionally summarizing what I had heard to make sure I understood correctly. It sounds like you're saying that the main challenge isn't the work itself, but feeling like your efforts aren't recognized. Is that right? This practice not only prevented misunderstandings, but also helped people feel truly heard and understood. The effect on my teaching was revolutionary. Instead of beginning with what I thought students needed to learn, I began by listening to what they felt they needed to understand. Instead of imposing my agenda on every conversation, I learned to discover what was really on people's minds and hearts. But the most profound impact was personal. Learning to listen deeply changed how I saw other people and how I understood human nature. I realized that everyone has a story worth hearing, insights worth considering, and experiences worth understanding. The quiet person in the corner might have the most interesting perspective in the room. The person who seems difficult or disagreeable might be carrying burdens that would break a weaker person. This shift in perspective, from seeing listening as a prelude to speaking, to seeing it as a gift you give to another person, not just my relationships, but my entire approach to human interaction. I learned that in a world full of people talking, the person who listens has unlimited opportunities to build respect, influence, and genuine connection. My debate medal from college sits in a drawer in my study, a bronze reminder of one of the most damaging misconceptions of my early life, that winning arguments leads to winning respect. It took me years to understand that the opposite is true. Arguments destroy respect, even when you win them, especially when you win them. The lesson came brutally clear during a dinner party in 1922. I was seated next to a prominent businessman who made a confident statement about Shakespearean authorship that I knew to be completely incorrect. Being fresh from my debate training and proud of my literary knowledge, I couldn't resist correcting him. I presented my evidence, systematically quoted sources from memory, and dismantled his position with what I thought was impressive intellectual precision. I won the argument completely. I also lost a potential friendship, business connection, and any respect that man might have had for me. He spent the rest of the evening avoiding me, and when we encountered each other at future social gatherings, his attitude toward me was cool and distant. I had proven I was right, but I had made him feel wrong, foolish, and publicly embarrassed. That night, I realized that arguments are one of the most destructive forces in human relationships. No matter how logical your position, no matter how compelling your evidence, no matter how politely you present your case, when you argue with someone, you're essentially telling them they're wrong. And when you make someone feel wrong, you damage their ego, trigger their defenses, and create resentment that can last for years. The psychology of arguments is fascinating and depressing. When someone's beliefs or opinions are challenged, their brain responds as if they're under physical attack. The same defensive mechanisms that protect us from bodily harm are triggered by intellectual threats. Heart rate increases, stress hormones flood the system, and rational thinking becomes nearly impossible. The person isn't just defending their position, they're defending their sense of self. Even worse, winning an argument often strengthens the other person's commitment to their original position. When people feel attacked, they don't become more open to alternative viewpoints, they become more entrenched in their existing beliefs. They start looking for ways to discredit not just your arguments, but you personally. They begin to see you as an adversary rather than a colleague or friend. I began studying successful people who commanded widespread respect, and I noticed something remarkable. They rarely argued with anyone about anything. When they encountered opinions different from their own, they found ways to explore those differences without creating conflict. They asked questions instead of making statements. They expressed curiosity rather than contradiction. They sought to understand rather than to correct. I started experimenting with this approach in my own interactions. When someone expressed a view I disagreed with, instead of launching into my counter-argument, I would say something like, "That's interesting. I'd never thought about it that way. What led you to that conclusion? Or help me understand your perspective on this." The results were remarkable. Instead of creating defensive hostility, these responses often led to fascinating conversations where both parties learned something new. The other person felt heard and respected rather than attacked and wrong. And often, through the process of explaining their position more fully, they would begin to see its weaknesses themselves and modify their views without any direct challenge from me. I discovered that you can disagree with someone's ideas without disagreeing with them personally. You can explore different perspectives without making anyone feel foolish or wrong. You can even change people's minds, but only when they don't feel like you're trying to defeat them in intellectual combat. The transformation in my relationships was dramatic. People began seeking out my opinions precisely because they knew I wouldn't use those opportunities to attack their ideas. They felt safe sharing their thoughts with me because they trusted that I would treat their perspectives with respect, even if I didn't share them. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that avoiding arguments didn't mean avoiding important conversations or difficult topics. It meant approaching those conversations with a different spirit, one of exploration rather than conquest, understanding rather than victory, connection rather than competition. When I encountered serious disagreements, I learned to say things like, "I have a different perspective on this, and I'm curious about how we might look at it together," rather than "You're wrong about this." I would share my views as additions to the conversation, rather than corrections of their mistakes. Another way to think about this might be ... or I've had experiences that led me to see it differently ... This approach required swallowing my ego and abandoning the satisfaction that comes from proving others wrong. But the respect and influence I gained were far more valuable than any intellectual victory. People began to see me as someone who was wise rather than merely clever, diplomatic rather than just argumentative, collaborative rather than competitive. I also learned that the strongest position in any disagreement is often expressing genuine curiosity about the other person's viewpoint. When you say, "I'm really interested in understanding how you see this," you accomplish several things simultaneously. You make the other person feel important and heard. You gather information that might actually change your own perspective, and you position yourself as someone who is confident enough in your own views that you don't need to defend them aggressively. The practice taught me something profound about human nature. People don't want to be defeated in arguments, want to be understood in conversations. They don't want their ideas attacked. They want their perspectives appreciated. When you give people this gift, when you engage with their ideas respectfully rather than combatively, they become more open to considering your viewpoints as well. My old debate medal reminds me daily that winning arguments is a hollow victory that costs more than it gains. True influence comes not from defeating others intellectually, but from engaging with them respectfully, learning from their perspectives, and finding ways to bridge differences rather than exploit them. In a world full of people trying to prove they're right, the person who focuses on understanding others becomes a magnet for respect and genuine connection. There's a torn page in my teaching journal from 1923 that serves as a permanent reminder of one of the most humiliating mistakes of my career. I had prepared what I thought was a brilliant lesson on historical facts, and when one of my adult students confidently stated something that was completely incorrect, I couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate my superior knowledge. "Actually, Thomas, you're wrong about that," I said, with what I thought was gentle authority. The Battle of Hastings was in 1066, not 1166. I then proceeded to provide the correct information, complete with additional historical context that would surely impress the entire class with my expertise. What happened next was a masterclass in human psychology that I'll never forget. Thomas's face flushed red, his jaw tightened, and for the rest of the evening, he sat in stony silence. He never participated in another discussion, and within 2 weeks, he had dropped out of the class entirely. I later learned that he told several people in town that I was one of those know-it-all teachers who makes you feel stupid. That torn page marks where I ripped out my lesson plan that night and rewrote my entire approach to correction and instruction. I realized I had committed one of the most destructive acts possible in human relations. I had made someone feel wrong in front of others. The words "you're wrong" are perhaps the most relationship-damaging phrase in the English language. When you tell someone they're wrong, you're not just correcting information, you're attacking their judgment, their intelligence, their credibility. You're essentially saying, "I'm smarter than you, I know better than you, and you should feel diminished by your mistake." The human ego cannot tolerate this assault without fighting back. When you tell someone they're wrong, you trigger an immediate defensive response that makes it virtually impossible for them to actually hear or accept the correct information you're trying to share. They become focused not on learning the truth, but on protecting their dignity and finding ways to discredit you. I began experimenting with different ways to handle situations where people had incorrect information or misguided ideas. Instead of direct contradiction, I learned to say things like, "That's interesting. I had understood it differently. Let me share what I learned and see what you think." Or, "I might be mistaken, but I thought it was... How do you see it?" These approaches accomplished something remarkable. They preserved the other person's dignity, while still introducing correct information. Instead of feeling attacked and defensive, people felt respected and curious. They became partners in discovering the truth rather than opponents in an intellectual battle. I discovered that you can correct someone's mistake without making them feel like a mistake. You can share accurate information without implying that their inaccurate information makes them inadequate. You can teach without making the other person feel ignorant. The key is to position yourself not as the superior authority delivering truth to the inferior student, but as a fellow learner sharing information that might be helpful. When you say, "I might be wrong about this, but I thought," you give the other person permission to save face while considering new information. You make it possible for them to change their mind without feeling defeated. This approach required a fundamental shift in how I thought about being right. Instead of seeing correct information as ammunition to prove my superiority, I began seeing it as a gift I could offer others in a way that made them feel capable rather than inadequate. Instead of using my knowledge to diminish others, I used it to elevate them. The transformation in my classroom was immediate and profound. Students began asking more questions because they knew I wouldn't make them feel stupid for not knowing the answers. They started admitting when they were confused or uncertain because they trusted that I would help them learn without embarrassing them. They became more engaged in discussions because they felt safe to express their thoughts without fear of public correction. But the real revelation came when I applied this principle beyond the classroom, in social conversations, in business meetings, in family discussions. I found that people became more receptive to my ideas when I presented them as alternatives rather than corrections. When I said, another way to look at this might be ... instead of that's not right, people actually listened more carefully and were more likely to adopt the perspectives I was sharing. I learned that pride is a more powerful force than logic in human decision-making. People will often cling to incorrect beliefs rather than admit they were wrong, especially if admitting error means losing face or feeling diminished. But when you give them a way to be right while adopting new information, they become remarkably open to change. The practice also taught me about the difference between being right and being effective. I could be absolutely correct about facts, while being completely wrong about how to share those facts in a way that actually influenced people. Truth without tact is often useless, and accuracy without sensitivity can be destructive. I developed what I came to call diplomatic honesty, the art of sharing truth in ways that preserve dignity and encourage openness. Instead of blunt contradiction, I learned to use phrases like I wonder if ... or what if we considered ... or it might be worth exploring ... These approaches honored the other person's intelligence while introducing new possibilities for understanding. The compound effect of this change was remarkable. People began seeking out my opinions because they knew I would share them respectfully. They asked for my advice because they trusted that I wouldn't make them feel foolish for needing guidance. They engaged in deeper conversations with me because they felt safe to explore ideas without fear of judgment or correction. That torn page from my journal reminds me daily that the goal of communication isn't to prove how much I know, but to help others learn and grow while preserving their dignity and self. When you master the art of sharing truth without making others feel wrong, you become someone people turn to for guidance, wisdom, and support. And that is worth far more than any intellectual victory. In 1924, I stood before a class of 40 adult students and did something that every teacher is trained never to do. I publicly admitted that I had been completely wrong about something I had taught them the week before. What happened next revolutionized my understanding of how vulnerability creates respect rather than destroying it. I had confidently presented what I believed to be historical fact about the development of the telegraph, complete with dates, names, and technical details. A student had raised a question that I had dismissed with assured authority. But over the weekend, my own research revealed that I had been entirely incorrect, not just on minor details, but on fundamental facts that made my entire presentation misleading. Every instinct told me to quietly correct the error without acknowledging my mistake. I could have simply presented the accurate information as additional research or new insights without admitting that my previous teaching had been wrong. My pride certainly preferred this approach, and conventional wisdom suggested that admitting mistakes would undermine my authority as an instructor. Instead, I began that Monday evening class with words that felt terrifying to speak. Before we continue tonight, I need to apologize to all of you. Last week, I taught you information about the telegraph that was completely incorrect. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for misleading you. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of losing respect, I watched my students' faces transform with surprise and admiration. Instead of questioning my competence, they leaned forward with increased attention and trust. One student actually said, "That takes real courage, Professor Carnegie." That evening became one of the most engaged and productive classes I had ever taught. Students asked more questions, shared more of their own thoughts, and participated more actively than they ever had before. By admitting my mistake, I had somehow increased rather than decreased my authority in that room. This experience taught me something profound about human psychology. People respect those who are strong enough to admit their weaknesses more than those who pretend to be perfect. When you acknowledge your mistakes quickly and honestly, you demonstrate several qualities that automatically generate respect, integrity, courage, humility, and security in your own worth. The psychology behind this principle is fascinating. When someone makes a mistake and tries to cover it up or shift blame, it creates suspicion and discomfort in others. We sense the deception, and we begin to question not just their honesty about this situation, but their reliability in general. We start wondering what else they might be hiding or misrepresenting. But when someone admits their mistake immediately and directly, it disarms criticism and creates trust. We think, here's someone who's honest even when it's difficult, who has enough integrity to tell the truth even when it hurts, who's secure enough to acknowledge imperfection. These are exactly the qualities we look for in people we want to respect and follow. I began experimenting with this principle in all areas of my life. When I made scheduling errors, instead of making excuses, I would say, I made a mistake with my calendar, and I apologize for the confusion. When I gave incorrect advice, instead of defending my reasoning, I would acknowledge, I was wrong about that suggestion, and I'm sorry for steering you in the wrong direction. The results were consistently remarkable. Instead of losing credibility, I gained it. Instead of appearing weak, I appeared strong. Instead of being seen as fallible, I was seen as trustworthy. People began coming to me more readily for advice because they knew I wouldn't try to cover up my mistakes if my guidance proved incorrect. But the real breakthrough came when I understood the reciprocal effect of admitting mistakes. When you acknowledge your own errors quickly and honestly, you create psychological safety for others to admit theirs as well. You model the behavior you want to see, and you make it easier for others to be honest about their own shortcomings. This transformed my teaching completely. Instead of creating an environment where students felt they had to appear perfect, I created one where mistakes were seen as learning opportunities. Students became more willing to take intellectual risks, to ask questions that revealed their confusion, to admit when they didn't understand something. The classroom became a place of genuine learning rather than a performance space, where everyone pretended to know more than they did. The principle also taught me about the difference between strength and stubbornness. True strength lies in being secure enough to acknowledge when you're wrong. Stubbornness, refusing to admit mistakes, even when evidence is overwhelming, is actually a sign of weakness and insecurity. It suggests that your ego is so fragile that it cannot tolerate being incorrect about anything. I learned to distinguish between admitting mistakes and diminishing yourself. When you acknowledge an error, you're not saying you're incompetent or worthless, you're saying you're human and honest. You're demonstrating that your commitment to truth is stronger than your need to appear infallible. The practice required swallowing my pride repeatedly, but the respect it generated was worth far more than any prideful protection of my ego. I discovered that people don't expect perfection from their leaders, teachers, or friends. They expect honesty, integrity, and the wisdom to learn from errors. I also found that admitting mistakes quickly actually prevents most criticism. When you beat your critics to the punch by acknowledging your error before they point it out, you remove their ammunition and often earn their respect for your honesty. You turn a potential attack into an opportunity for connection. The letter I wrote to that class, formally apologizing for my incorrect teaching, became one of my most treasured documents. It reminds me that vulnerability, when coupled with integrity, is a source of strength rather than weakness. In a world where people desperately try to appear perfect, the person who can honestly admit their mistakes stands out as someone genuinely worthy of respect and trust. True leadership isn't about being right all the time, it's about being honest all the time. especially when honesty requires admitting you were wrong. My first business card was a simple affair, just my name, Dale Carnegie, and public speaking instructor in plain black text on white cardstock. But that humble card opened doors that elaborate credentials never could have, and it taught me one of the most powerful principles of human relations. Warmth is the master key that unlocks every heart. The lesson came during my early days of building my teaching practice. I was calling on business owners to offer my services, and I was meeting resistance everywhere I went. Despite my qualifications and enthusiasm, I was getting polite rejections from one potential client after another. I was becoming discouraged and began to doubt whether I had anything valuable to offer. Then I met Mr. Patterson, the owner of a small manufacturing company. When his secretary announced me, I expected another brief, formal rejection. Instead, Mr. Patterson greeted me at his office door with a genuine smile, a firm handshake, and the kind of warmth that made me feel like I was visiting an old friend rather than making a cold sales call. "Mr. Carnegie," he said with evident pleasure, "please, come in. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Can I get you some coffee? I want to hear all about what you're doing to help people become better speakers." I hadn't even begun my presentation, and already I felt completely different about this interaction. His friendly approach had transformed my nervousness into confidence, my defensiveness into openness, my sales pitch into a genuine conversation between two people who shared common interests. By the end of our meeting, Mr. Patterson had not only hired me to work with his management team, but he had also given me referrals to 3 other business owners. More importantly, he had taught me something invaluable about the power of beginning every interaction in a friendly way. The psychology behind this principle is both simple and profound. When someone greets you with genuine warmth and friendliness, your brain immediately categorizes them as safe, trustworthy, and likable. Your defenses lower, your attention increases, and your willingness to listen and cooperate expands dramatically. You find yourself wanting to help this person, to please them, to live up to their positive expectations. Conversely, when someone approaches you with coldness, formality, or aggression, your brain activates its threat detection systems. You become guarded, suspicious, and resistant, even if their message is reasonable. Your psychological state makes you less likely to receive it positively. I began experimenting with this principle systematically. Before every important conversation, I made a conscious decision to approach it with genuine friendliness. I would smile authentically, use a warm tone of voice, and look for something positive to say about the person or the situation. The difference in responses was remarkable every time. When I needed to discuss poor performance with a student, instead of beginning with criticism, I would start by acknowledging something they were doing well. "John, I've noticed how much effort you've been putting into your preparation lately. That commitment really shows, and I appreciate it. I wanted to talk with you about some ways we might help you get even better results from all that hard work." This approach accomplished several things simultaneously. It put John at ease by starting with recognition rather than criticism. It demonstrated that I was paying attention to his efforts, not just his failures. And it positioned our conversation as collaborative improvement rather than punitive correction. The transformation in how people responded to difficult conversations was dramatic. Instead of becoming defensive and resistant, they became receptive and cooperative. Instead of feeling attacked, they felt supported. Instead of dreading interactions with me, they began seeking me out for guidance and advice. But I learned that friendliness must be genuine to be effective. People have an uncanny ability to detect artificial warmth, and nothing destroys trust faster than sensing that someone is manipulating you with fake friendliness. The warmth must come from a sincere appreciation for the other person's humanity and a genuine desire for positive connection. I discovered that beginning in a friendly way is particularly powerful. when you need to address problems or conflicts. When you start with warmth and genuine care for the relationship, you create psychological safety that allows the other person to hear difficult feedback without becoming defensive. The principle also taught me about the compound effect of consistent friendliness. When you make it your practice to begin every interaction with genuine warmth, you build a reputation as someone who is pleasant to work with, easy to approach, and genuinely caring about others. People begin seeking you out because they know that talking with you will be a positive experience. I started paying attention to how different approaches affected the entire trajectory of conversations. When I began meetings with complaints or criticism, the entire interaction remained tense and unproductive. When I began with appreciation and friendliness, even difficult topics could be addressed constructively. But perhaps the most important discovery was that beginning in a friendly way changes not just how others respond to you, but how you feel about the interaction yourself. When you approach people with genuine warmth, you find yourself actually feeling more positive about them and the situation. The act of being friendly makes you feel friendlier. This principle transformed my teaching, my business relationships, and my personal interactions. Students looked forward to my classes because they knew they would be greeted with warmth rather than judgment. Business associates sought me out for collaborations because they enjoyed working with someone who made every interaction pleasant. Friends and family members felt comfortable bringing their concerns to me because they knew I would receive them with care and understanding. That simple business card reminds me daily that in human relations, how you begin often determines how you end. When you start with genuine friendliness, you create an atmosphere where respect, cooperation, and positive outcomes become natural rather than forced. In a world where many people approach interactions with suspicion, defensiveness, or coldness, the person who consistently begins in a friendly way becomes a magnet for positive relationships and mutual respect. In 1925, I developed what became my most effective sales training manual, not for selling products, but for selling ideas. The core principle was deceptively simple. Agreement is a psychological habit that can be cultivated, and once someone begins saying yes to you, they become increasingly likely to continue saying yes. The revelation came during a particularly challenging conversation with a skeptical school administrator who was resistant to bringing my public speaking courses to his district. He had already decided against the program before I arrived, and his body language made his opposition clear from the moment I entered his office. Instead of launching into my prepared presentation about the benefits of public speaking training, I began with questions I knew he would answer positively. "Mr. Henderson, you've been in education for over 20 years, haven't you?" "Yes, and in that time, you've probably noticed that some students struggle to express themselves clearly." "Yes. Would you agree that the ability to communicate effectively is becoming increasingly important in today's world?" "Yes. Have you found that students who can speak with confidence tend to be more successful in their studies?" "Yes." By the time I began discussing my specific program, Mr. Henderson had already said yes to me 4 times. His psychological momentum was moving in a positive direction, and his resistance had begun to soften. When I finally made my proposal, instead of an automatic rejection, I received genuine consideration and ultimately acceptance. This experience taught me something profound about human psychology. Our minds seek consistency. Once we begin agreeing with someone, we unconsciously look for reasons to continue agreeing. Conversely, once we start disagreeing, we tend to find fault with everything they say, even ideas we might normally accept. The principle works because each yes creates a small psychological commitment. When someone agrees with you, they're not just accepting your statement, they're aligning themselves with your perspective. Each agreement makes the next agreement easier, building momentum toward larger acceptance of your ideas. I began structuring all my important conversations around this principle. Before presenting any new concept or making any request, I would start with points of agreement. I would ask questions or make statements that I knew would generate positive responses, creating a foundation of consensus before building toward my main objective. When working with reluctant students, instead of immediately addressing their fear of public speaking, I would begin with agreements. You want to be successful in your career, don't you? Yes? And you've probably noticed that people who can express themselves clearly seem to have advantages. Yes. Would you agree that confidence in communication could help you achieve your goals? Yes. By the time we discussed their specific speaking anxieties, they were already psychologically committed to the value of improvement. But I learned that this principle must be used ethically and genuinely. The goal isn't to manipulate people into agreements they don't truly support, but to help them recognize alignments that already exist. You're not creating false consensus, you're uncovering real areas of agreement that can serve as foundations for broader understanding. The technique taught me to look for common ground before exploring differences. In any conversation, there are usually numerous points on which people already agree, even when they disagree on the main issue. By starting with these areas of consensus, you create a collaborative rather than adversarial atmosphere. I discovered that the quality of questions matters enormously. Instead of asking yes or no questions that feel manipulative, I learned to ask questions that genuinely explored shared values and common concerns. What's most important to you about your employees' development usually generates much better engagement than don't you think training is important? The principle also works in reverse. I learned to avoid early disagreements that could set negative momentum. If someone makes a statement I disagree with, instead of immediately contradicting them, I look for aspects of their position I can acknowledge before introducing alternative perspectives. I can understand why you see it that way preserves the possibility of agreement while opening space for different viewpoints. The transformation in my teaching effectiveness was remarkable. Students who came to class resistant to public speaking would find themselves gradually becoming advocates for the skills they were learning. By starting each lesson with points they could easily accept, I helped them build psychological momentum toward embracing more challenging concepts. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that getting people to say yes isn't about winning them over to your side. It's about helping them discover what they already believe. Most people have wisdom, values, and insights that align with positive change, but they need help accessing and articulating those beliefs. When I helped students recognize that they already valued clear communication, already wanted to be more confident, already believed in self-improvement, they weren't being convinced of something foreign, they were being reconnected with their own aspirations. The yes responses weren't agreements with me, they were affirmations of their own deeper convictions. This understanding made me more effective, not because I became more persuasive, but because I became better at helping people connect with their own motivations. Instead of imposing my agenda on them, I learned to help them discover how my suggestions aligned with their existing goals and values. The sales training manual I developed became one of my most requested resources, not because it taught manipulation techniques, but because it taught genuine relationship building. When you help people say yes to ideas they already believe, when you build on agreements that genuinely exist, when you create momentum based on shared values, you're not manipulating, you're facilitating authentic connection and mutual understanding. The principle reminded me that most people want to be agreeable, helpful, and positive. When you give them opportunities to express these natural tendencies through small agreements, you create an atmosphere where larger agreements become natural and comfortable rather than forced or artificial. Every semester, I would distribute evaluation forms asking my students to rate various aspects of the course. But there was one question that consistently taught me more about human nature than any psychology textbook. Which instructor made the greatest impression on you? Year after year, the responses revealed the same pattern. Students didn't choose the most eloquent speakers or the most knowledgeable teachers. They chose the instructors who had given them the most opportunity to express themselves. This discovery fundamentally changed how I understood influence and respect. I had been operating under the assumption that to be impressive, I needed to do impressive talking. But my students were teaching me that to be influential, I needed to create space for others to do the talking. The breakthrough came during a faculty meeting, where I was trying to convince my colleagues to adopt a new teaching methodology. I had prepared an elaborate presentation with charts, statistics, and compelling arguments. But as I launched into my pitch, I noticed glazed eyes, fidgeting, and the subtle signs of people mentally checking out. Halfway through my presentation, I stopped and said, "But before I continue, I'm curious about your experiences. What challenges are you facing in your classrooms that a new approach might help address?" For the next 45 minutes, my colleagues shared their frustrations, their successes, their concerns, and their hopes. I asked follow-up questions, acknowledged their insights, and listened with genuine interest. By the end of that meeting, they were asking me to tell them more about my methodology. They weren't being sold tooth. They were discovering how my suggestions might address the very concerns they had just articulated. The approach they had been resistant to when I was talking became compelling when they were talking. This experience taught me something profound about human psychology. People are far more interested in expressing their own thoughts than in hearing yours. No matter how brilliant your thoughts might be, everyone carries around a constant internal dialogue, concerns, ideas, experiences, opinions that they rarely get to share fully. When you give someone the gift of complete attention and genuine curiosity about their inner world, you become incredibly valuable to them. The principle goes deeper than just being polite or patient. When people talk about their thoughts and experiences, several powerful psychological processes occur. They clarify their own thinking through the act of articulation. They feel validated and important because someone is genuinely interested in their perspective. And they begin to associate the positive feelings generated by this self-expression with you. I started experimenting with this approach in all my interactions. In business meetings, instead of presenting my ideas first, I would ask questions that encouraged others to share their thoughts. What's been working well for you? What challenges are you seeing? How do you think we might approach this? The quality of those meetings improved dramatically as people felt heard and valued rather than lectured to. But I learned that letting others do most of the talking requires genuine skill and intention. It's not passive, waiting for your turn to speak. It's active facilitation of their self-expression. You need to ask thoughtful questions that help people explore their own ideas more deeply. You need to listen, not just for information, but for emotions, concerns, and aspirations. You need to show through your responses that you're truly engaged with what they're sharing. The transformation in my relationships was remarkable. Students began staying after class to continue conversations, not because they wanted to hear more from me, but because they wanted to share more of their own thoughts and receive my genuine attention. Colleagues sought me out for advice, not because I had all the answers, but because I helped them discover their own wisdom through thoughtful questioning and careful listening. I discovered that when people do most of the talking, they often convince themselves of ideas you could never have sold them directly. When you ask the right questions and listen carefully, people will work through problems, identify solutions, and commit to changes that they might have resisted if you had simply told them what to do. The practice also taught me about the difference between influence and persuasion. Persuasion involves convincing someone to accept your ideas. Influence involves helping them discover ideas that resonate with their own values and experiences. When people reach conclusions through their own exploration and articulation, they own those conclusions in ways that create lasting commitment. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that letting others do most of the talking isn't a technique. It's a mindset shift from self-focus to other focus. When you become genuinely fascinated by other people's thoughts, experiences, and perspectives, when you find their inner worlds more interesting than your own external agenda, people sense that authenticity and respond with unprecedented openness and trust. The evaluation forms taught me that students didn't remember my most brilliant lectures or my cleverest insights. They remembered the conversations where I had helped them discover and articulate their own thoughts and feelings. They felt respected, valued, and understood them. They associated those powerful, positive emotions with me in a world full of people desperate to be heard. The person who truly listens wields almost magical influence. When you resist the urge to impress others with your words and instead focus on drawing out their words, you create connections that go far beyond professional courtesy or social politeness. You create genuine human bonds based on mutual respect and authentic interest. The irony is beautiful. By saying less, you become more memorable. By letting others shine, you become more influential. By making others feel important through your attention to their thoughts, you become important to them in return. In my filing cabinet, I keep detailed notes from a series of meetings with business leaders in 1926 that taught me one of the most powerful principles of human motivation. People will fight for ideas they believe they created, but they will resist even brilliant ideas that feel imposed upon them. The lesson emerged during my work with Harrison Manufacturing, where the owner was struggling to implement efficiency improvements that his employees were resisting. Mr. Harrison had hired consultants who had developed excellent recommendations, but the workers were sabotaging every change, claiming the new methods were impractical and disruptive. Instead of trying to convince the employees to accept the consultant's recommendations, I suggested a different approach. We organized a series of meetings where we asked the workers themselves to identify problems and brainstorm solutions. I carefully guided the discussions with questions that would lead them toward the same conclusions the consultants had reached, but without ever mentioning the consultant's report. What slows down your work the most? I would ask. If you could change one thing about the current process, what would it be? How might we organize things differently to save time? Through their own analysis and discussion, the workers identified virtually every problem the consultants had found and proposed, solutions that were remarkably similar to the professional recommendations. But here's what was fascinating. These were no longer management's ideas being forced on the workers. These were the workers' own ideas for improving their workplace. The same changes that had been resisted when presented by outsiders were embraced enthusiastically when the workers felt they had created them. Within 6 months, Harrison Manufacturing had implemented every efficiency improvement, productivity had increased by 40%, and employee satisfaction had reached an all-time high. The workers weren't just following new procedures, they were proud advocates for methods they believed they had invented. This experience revealed something profound about human psychology. Ownership creates commitment. When people feel that an idea belongs to them, they become emotionally invested in its success. They will work harder to implement it, defend it against criticism, and persist through obstacles that would cause them to abandon ideas they perceive as foreign impositions. The principle extends far beyond workplace efficiency. I began applying it in my teaching, and the results were remarkable. Instead of presenting concepts as established facts that students needed to accept, I would guide them through discovery, processes that led them to reach the same conclusions independently. When teaching about the importance of preparation in public speaking, instead of lecturing about it, I would ask questions. When you've heard really effective speakers, what did you notice about their presentations? What happens when someone seems unprepared? How do you think successful speakers develop their confidence? Through their own analysis. Students would identify preparation as crucial, and because they had discovered this principle themselves, they were far more likely to actually prepare thoroughly for their own speeches. But I learned that this approach requires genuine skill and patience. You can't simply manipulate people into thinking your ideas are theirs. The guidance must be subtle, the questions must be genuine, and the conclusions must emerge naturally from their own thought processes. If people sense that you're leading them toward predetermined answers, the technique backfires and creates resentment. The key is to plant seeds of ideas rather than transplant fully grown concepts. You ask questions that encourage people to explore certain directions, but you let them develop the insights at their own pace and in their own way. Often, their version of the idea will be better than your original concept because it's tailored to their specific situation and perspective. I discovered that this approach works even when people initially disagree with the conclusion you're hoping they'll reach. By helping them examine the issue from multiple angles, asking them to consider various scenarios, and encouraging them to think through the implications of different approaches, you create opportunities for them to change their own minds rather than having to accept your judgment. The transformation in my consulting work was dramatic. Instead of being seen as an outside expert trying to impose solutions, I became a facilitator who helped organizations discover their own answers. Clients implemented my recommendations more consistently because they felt ownership of the ideas. They paid me more because they valued the process of discovery I facilitated, and they referred me to others because they were proud of the solutions they had developed. But perhaps the most important insight was that this principle creates lasting change rather than temporary compliance. When people feel forced to accept ideas, they often abandon them as soon as external pressure is removed. But when they feel they've created the ideas themselves, they maintain commitment even when no one is watching, because the ideas have become part of their identity rather than external impositions. The practice also taught me about the difference between manipulation and facilitation. Manipulation involves deceiving people into thinking your ideas are theirs. Facilitation involves helping people discover insights that genuinely emerge from their own analysis and experience. The goal isn't to trick them into accepting your predetermined conclusions, but to guide them through thought processes that lead to authentic discoveries. I learned to ask myself before every important conversation, how can I help this person discover what I hope they'll understand? Instead of preparing arguments to convince them, I would prepare questions to guide their exploration. Instead of marshalling evidence to prove my point, I would create opportunities for them to reach their own conclusions. Those collaboration notes remind me daily that the most influential leaders aren't those who have the best ideas, but those who help others develop great ideas. When you master the art of guided discovery, when you learn to plant seeds rather than transplant trees, when you help people feel genuine ownership of important insights, you create the kind of commitment and enthusiasm that no amount of persuasion or authority could ever achieve. In my office filing cabinet, I keep a thick folder labeled "Impossible Situations," case studies of conflicts that seemed absolutely irreconcilable until I learned to apply what became the most transformative principle of my entire career. Genuine empathy has the power to bridge any gap between human beings. The most dramatic example involved two department heads at a manufacturing company who had been engaged in such bitter conflict that they refused to attend the same meetings. Production was suffering, employees were choosing sides, and the company owner was considering firing both men rather than continue dealing with their destructive antagonism. When I arrived to mediate their dispute, I found two intelligent, capable. Professionals who had convinced themselves that the other was incompetent, malicious, and determined to sabotage the company's success. Each had built an ironclad case for why he was right and the other was wrong. Each was absolutely certain that any reasonable person would immediately see the justice of his position and the absurdity of his opponent's stance. Instead of trying to determine who was right or attempting to find a compromise between their positions, I did something that surprised both men. I spent individual time with each one, not to gather ammunition for either side, but to genuinely understand how the situation looked from their perspective. With Robert, the production manager, I learned about the crushing pressure he felt to meet impossible deadlines with inadequate resources. I came to understand his frustration with what he saw as the sales department's unrealistic promises to customers. I felt his anxiety about quality standards being compromised in the rush to fulfill orders that should never have been accepted. From his viewpoint, the sales manager was recklessly jeopardizing the company's reputation for short-term gain. With William, the sales manager, I discovered the tremendous stress of trying to maintain customer relationships while dealing with what he perceived as production's inflexibility and excuses. I understood his perspective that the production department was using minor technical issues to justify major delays, that they were more interested in protecting their convenient routines than serving customers. From his viewpoint, the production manager was undermining the company's competitiveness with an obsession for perfectionism that customers didn't want to pay for. The remarkable thing was that both men's perspectives made complete sense when seen through their eyes. Robert wasn't being unreasonable. He was trying to maintain standards under impossible conditions. William wasn't being reckless. He was trying to keep customers satisfied in a competitive market. Neither was evil or incompetent. They were both dedicated professionals facing legitimate pressures that put them in natural conflict. When I brought them together for our joint meeting, instead of starting with their points of disagreement, I began by reflecting back what I had learned about each man's challenges and pressures. I helped Robert understand the customer relationship pressures that William faced daily. I helped William appreciate the quality and resource constraints that Robert was managing constantly. Something magical happened as each man began to see the situation through the other's eyes. The anger and defensiveness melted away, replaced by recognition and even sympathy. They began to see each other not as adversaries, but as fellow professionals facing different aspects of the same complex challenge. Within 2 hours, they had developed a collaborative solution that addressed both sets of concerns. More importantly, they had established a foundation of mutual respect that transformed their ongoing working relationship. What had seemed like an impossible conflict became a powerful partnership built on understanding rather than opposition. This experience taught me that most conflicts aren't really about right versus wrong. They're about different perspectives, based on different experiences, pressures, and responsibilities. When you take the time to honestly understand someone else's point of view, you often discover that their position makes perfect sense given their situation, even if it conflicts with your own needs or preferences. The principle requires setting aside your own perspective, temporarily not abandoning it, but postponing your advocacy for it until you've genuinely grasped theirs. This is incredibly difficult because our natural tendency is to listen to others only long enough to find flaws in their reasoning or ammunition for our counterarguments. But genuine empathy involves more than intellectual understanding of someone's position. It requires emotional comprehension of how they feel about the situation, what pressures they're experiencing, what concerns keep them awake at night, what hopes drive their decisions. You need to step into their shoes so completely that you can argue their position as persuasively as they could themselves. I began applying this principle systematically in all my conflict resolution work. Before attempting to solve any problem, I would invest time in truly understanding each party's perspective, pressures, and concerns. I would ask questions designed not to gather evidence for one side or another, but to comprehend how the situation felt to each person involved. The transformation in outcomes was remarkable. Conflicts that had seemed intractable began resolving themselves once people felt genuinely understood. Parents and teenagers who had been in constant battle found common ground when each side truly grasped the other's concerns. Business partners who had been considering dissolution discovered renewed collaboration when they understood each other's pressures and motivations. But the real revelation was how this practice changed not just the conflicts I was mediating, but my own relationships and interactions. When I made genuine effort to see situations from others' perspectives, my own positions often became more nuanced and thoughtful. I discovered that understanding someone else's viewpoint didn't require abandoning my own. It often enriched and improved my own thinking. The practice also taught me to distinguish between understanding and agreement. You can thoroughly comprehend why someone sees a situation differently without necessarily accepting their conclusions. But that understanding creates a foundation for productive dialogue that would be impossible without it. I learned that when people feel genuinely understood, they become much more willing to listen to alternative perspectives. When you demonstrate that you've made the effort to truly grasp their viewpoint, they're more likely to extend the same courtesy to you. Understanding becomes reciprocal, creating opportunities for mutual influence and collaborative solutions. The case files in that folder remind me daily that behind every impossible conflict are human beings with legitimate concerns, valid pressures, and understandable motivations. When you approach disputes with genuine curiosity about how the situation looks through other people's eyes, when you invest the time and emotional energy required to truly understand their perspectives, you discover that most conflicts contain the seeds of their own resolution. In 1927, I was asked to write a fundraising letter for the YMCA that would reach thousands of potential donors. The previous appeals had focused on the organization's financial needs and operational costological, straightforward requests that had generated disappointing results. Instead, I wrote a letter that would teach me one of the most profound principles about human motivation. People want desperately to see themselves as noble, generous, and good, and they will rise to meet expectations that honor their highest aspirations. The letter I crafted didn't mention budgets or expenses. Instead, it painted a picture of young men finding direction and purpose, of communities becoming stronger through character development, of lives being transformed through the simple act of someone caring enough to invest in human potential. I wrote about the donor's opportunity to be part of something meaningful, to leave a legacy that would outlast their lifetime, to make a difference in ways that money alone could never measure. The response was extraordinary. Not only did the YMCA raise more money than ever before, but donors began volunteering their time, referring friends, and staying engaged with the organization long after their financial contributions. They hadn't just given money, they had invested in a vision of themselves as people who make the world better. This experience revealed something profound about human psychology. Beneath the surface of even the most pragmatic, cynical, or self-interested person lies someone who wants to matter, to contribute something meaningful, to be part of something bigger than themselves. When you appeal to these noble motives, you touch something deep in the human spirit that responds with enthusiasm and commitment. The principle works because it aligns your request with people's ideal self-image. Everyone carries around a vision of who they want to be at their best: generous, wise, helpful, principled, significant. When you frame your appeals in terms of these higher aspirations, you give people an opportunity to act out their noblest impulses and feel good about themselves. In the process, I began applying this approach to all my persuasive communication. When working with reluctant students, instead of focusing on their fears or deficiencies, I would appeal to their desire to grow, to contribute, to become the kind of person who could help others. I know you care about making a positive impact. I would say, the confidence and skills you develop here will enable you to influence others in ways that could change their lives. When consulting with business leaders about employee relations, instead of emphasizing productivity metrics or cost savings, I would frame improvements in terms of their opportunity to create an environment where people could flourish, where workers could take pride in their contributions, where leadership could be a force for human development rather than mere economic output. The transformation in responses was remarkable. People who had been resistant to change became advocates for improvement when they saw how changes aligned with their values. Students who had been motivated primarily by avoiding failure became energized by opportunities to serve others. Business leaders who had been focused on short-term profits began implementing long-term strategies that honored their deeper convictions about leadership and social responsibility. But I learned that appealing to noble motives must be genuine. To be effective, people have an uncanny ability to detect manipulation, and nothing destroys trust faster than sensing that someone is playing to your ego to achieve their own purposes. The appeal must be authentic, must genuinely believe that the person has these noble qualities, and that your request truly offers them an opportunity to express their higher nature. The principle also requires understanding what specific noble motives resonate with each individual. Some people are primarily motivated by a desire to help others. Some are driven by a need to create something lasting and meaningful. Some are inspired by opportunities to demonstrate excellence or integrity. Others respond to chances to be part of important causes or movements. I discovered that when you consistently appeal to people's noble motives, you actually help them become more noble. When you treat someone as generous, they become more generous. When you acknowledge their capacity for wisdom, they become wiser. When you recognize their potential for leadership, they develop leadership qualities. Your expectations become a kind of prophecy that people work to fulfill. The practice transformed my teaching completely. Instead of motivating students through fear of failure or promise of personal benefit, I began helping them see how developing confidence and communication skills would enable them to serve their families, communities, and causes they cared about. Students who had been learning reluctantly for their own advancement became passionate advocates for learning, when they understood how their growth could benefit others. But perhaps the most important discovery was that appealing to noble motives. Change is not just how others respond to you, but how you see them and how they see themselves. When you consistently look for and acknowledge the highest aspirations in others, you begin to see people not as they are in their weakest moments, but as they could become in their strongest ones. The practice requires faith in human nature, belief that people generally want to do the right thing, contribute something meaningful, and be part of positive change. This faith is often rewarded when you give people opportunities to live up to their own highest ideals rather than appealing to their lowest common denominators. That YMCA letter taught me that people will work harder, give more, and commit more deeply when they feel that their actions reflect their values and aspirations rather than just their needs or desires. When you help people see how your requests align with their noblest impulses, you create the kind of motivation that comes from within rather than from external pressure, and that internal motivation is the most powerful and lasting force for positive action. My final teaching certificate hangs in my study, but it represents far more than the end of a career. It symbolizes the completion of a life's work devoted to proving that respect is not an accident of birth, position, or circumstances, but a learnable skill that anyone can master. Over the decades, I watched thousands of students transform from invisible, overlooked individuals into magnetic leaders who commanded attention, admiration, and influence wherever they went. The principles I've shared aren't separate techniques to be applied occasionally. They're interconnected elements of a complete system for human relations that, when practiced consistently, creates a revolution in how others perceive and respond to you. Like the instruments in an orchestra, each principle enhances and amplifies the others, creating harmony that is far more powerful than any individual component. When you combine genuine interest in others with the practice of remembering their names, you don't just make people feel noticed, you make them feel valued and important. When you add deep listening to this foundation, you create connections that transcend superficial social interaction. When you avoid arguments while admitting your own mistakes, you demonstrate both strength and humility that people find irresistible. The compound effect of these principles working together is extraordinary. I've watched shy farmers become community leaders, tongue-tied clerks become influential managers, and socially awkward young people become charismatic figures who attract opportunities and relationships wherever they go. But the transformation isn't just external, it's internal. As people begin treating others with greater respect, they begin feeling more respectable themselves. Consider Margaret, a quiet bookkeeper who enrolled in my course because she was tired of being invisible in her workplace. She was competent at her job, but felt like nobody noticed her contributions or sought her opinions. Through consistent application of these principles, showing genuine interest in her colleagues, remembering details about their lives, listening deeply to their concerns, and appealing to their noble motives, she gradually became someone her co-workers sought out for advice and support. Within 18 months, Margaret had been promoted to office manager, not because she had gained new technical skills, but because she had become the kind of person others wanted to follow. She had developed what I call respect magnetism, the quality that draws people toward you and makes them eager to help you succeed. Or consider Frank, a factory supervisor whose workers barely tolerated his authority. He was technically competent, but struggled with morale and productivity issues. By learning to see situations from his workers' perspectives, by beginning every interaction in a friendly way, by letting his team members contribute ideas and feel ownership of improvements, he transformed a hostile work environment into a collaborative one. His department went from having the highest turnover rate in the company to having the lowest, and productivity increased by 60%, not through pressure or demands, but through voluntary commitment from workers who felt respected and valued. These transformations illustrate something crucial. When you consistently apply these principles, you don't just change how you interact with others, you change who you become. You develop genuine confidence that comes not from trying to impress people with your superiority, but from your ability to make them feel important and valued. You build influence that isn't based on position or authority, but on the magnetic power of making others feel good about themselves. The beauty of this system is that it becomes self-reinforcing. As people respond more positively to you, you feel more confident and generous in your interactions with them. As your relationships improve, you become more motivated to continue applying these principles. As you see the positive impact you're having on others, you begin to genuinely care more about their well-being and success. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this approach is how it spreads. When you treat people with genuine respect and consideration, they often begin treating others the same way. The person you've made feel important goes home and treats their family with greater warmth. The colleague you've listened to deeply becomes a better listener to their team members. The employee whose ideas you've valued begins encouraging ideas from others. This ripple effect means that mastering these principles doesn't just improve your own relationships, it contributes to creating a more respectful, considerate world. Every person you influence positively becomes a source of positive influence for others. Every relationship you improve through respect becomes a model for how human beings can interact at their best. The revolution I'm describing isn't a dramatic, overnight transformation. It's a gradual shift that occurs as you consistently apply these principles day after day, interaction after interaction. Some people will respond immediately to your new approach. Others will remain skeptical until your consistency proves your sincerity. But over time, as people experience the genuine care and respect you show them, they will begin to see you as someone special, someone they want to be around, someone they naturally respect and admire. The principles work regardless of your current position, education, or social status. I've seen janitors become beloved figures in their organizations by applying these principles, while I've watched highly educated executives remain isolated and disliked because they never learned to treat others with genuine respect. The power lies not in what you know or what position you hold, but in how you make others feel about themselves. My decades of teaching have convinced me that respect is the foundation of all meaningful human achievement. When you earn the respect of others, opportunities appear that would otherwise remain invisible. People want to help you succeed, recommend you for advancement, and include you in important conversations. Doors open not because you're pushing against them, but because others are opening them for you. This is the respect revolution, the understanding that in a world focused on getting respect, the real power lies in giving it. As I write what may be my final words on this subject that has consumed and fulfilled my life, I hold in my hands a letter I've written to future generations, to you who will carry these principles forward long after I'm gone. It contains everything I wish I could tell each person who struggles with feeling invisible, overlooked, or disrespected in a world that seems to reward only the loudest voices and the most aggressive personalities. You now possess something more valuable than money, more powerful than position, more lasting than fame: the knowledge of how to earn genuine respect from every person you encounter. These aren't theories I've read about or ideas I've borrowed from others. They're principles I've lived, tested, and proven in thousands of real-world situations, with real people facing real challenges. But knowledge without action is worthless. The principles I've shared will transform your life only if you transform them from intellectual concepts into daily practices. You must begin immediately, today, with the very next person you encounter. Show genuine interest in someone who expects to be ignored. Remember the name of someone who assumes they're forgettable. Listen deeply to someone who's used to being interrupted. Begin an interaction with warmth when others would begin with coldness. Don't wait until you feel confident about these principles before you begin applying them. Confidence comes through practice, not before it. Start with small, safe interactions: the checkout clerk at the grocery store, the receptionist at the office, the neighbor you rarely speak with. As you see these principles work in low-stakes situations, you'll gain the confidence to apply them in more important relationships and crucial conversations. Expect resistance, both from others and from yourself. Some people have been hurt so often that they'll be suspicious of genuine kindness, wondering what you want from them. Your own ego will rebel against focusing on others when it wants to be the center of attention. You'll be tempted to argue when you know you're right, to correct when you hear mistakes, to talk when you should listen. This is normal. Persist anyway. Remember that every master of these principles started exactly where you are now, knowing what to do but not yet having developed the habits that make these behaviors automatic. I made countless mistakes in my early attempts to apply these ideas. I sometimes came across as manipulative when I was trying to be strategic, fake when I was trying to be friendly, patronizing when I was trying to be encouraging. The difference between failure and success wasn't perfection, it was persistence. Track your progress by paying attention to how people respond to you over time. Notice when conversations become more enjoyable, when people seek you out for advice, when you're included in opportunities that used to pass you by. These are the real measures of your growing influence and respect. But here's what I want you to understand most deeply. The ultimate goal isn't to get respect, it's to become genuinely respectable. As you practice these principles, something wonderful will happen to your character. You'll become more interested in others and less self-absorbed. You'll develop genuine empathy and authentic concern for people's well-being. You'll find satisfaction in helping others succeed rather than just in your own advancement. This internal transformation is the real prize. The respect others give you is simply a reflection of the respect you've learned to give them. The influence you gain is the natural result of your focus on serving rather than being served. The opportunities that come your way are attracted by the magnetic power of someone who makes others feel valued and important. I challenge you to make a commitment that will change your life. For the next 30 days, apply at least one of these principles in every significant interaction you have. When you meet someone new, focus entirely on learning about them rather than impressing them. When you disagree with someone, seek first to understand their perspective before advocating for your own. When someone makes a mistake, find a way to address it without making them feel diminished. Keep a simple journal of what happens. Note how people respond differently to you. Record moments when these principles open doors or create opportunities. Document the internal changes you experience as you become more focused on others and less consumed with yourself. At the end of those 30 days, you'll have two choices. You can return to your old patterns of interaction, or you can continue developing the habits that will make you magnetic to others and valuable in every relationship. I'm confident you'll choose to continue, because once you experience the power of being respected and appreciated wherever you go, you'll never want to return to feeling invisible or overlooked. My time is ending, but yours is just beginning. You have the opportunity to build a legacy of respect that will outlast your life, not through monuments or wealth, but through the countless people whose lives you'll touch by treating them with dignity, consideration, and genuine care. Every person you influence positively will influence others in turn, creating ripples of respect that will spread far beyond what you can imagine. The world desperately needs more people who understand that true strength lies in lifting others up, that real influence comes from making others feel important, that lasting success is built on the foundation of genuine respect for human dignity. You can be one of those people. You can be someone who makes the world a little kinder, a little more considerate, a little more respectful simply by how you choose to treat others. This is my final challenge to you. Don't just read these principles live. Don't just understand them, embody them. Don't just appreciate them. Begin today. Begin now. Begin with the next person you encounter, and discover for yourself the transformative power of giving respect to receive respect. Future is yours to shape, one respectful interaction at a time.